I scolded my boyfriend's parents and thought about breaking up with him because he never defended me in conflicts. I have been with my boyfriend for almost 2 years now. For the most part, things are good between us when it's just us two. We laugh, we share dreams, and I've always thought we had a solid connection. But whenever we visit his parents, everything falls apart in ways I could never have imagined. His mom and dad, let's call them Mary and John, are a lot. They criticize everything about me. My clothes? Not classy enough. My job? Oh, that's not really stable, is it? Even the way I talk gets picked apart sometimes. I've tried to brush it off, telling myself it's just their way of being concerned, but it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Every time we're there, they manage to find something new to judge. It's not just the comments, though. Whenever we're at their house, they treat me like their personal servant. Mary will say something like, "Oh, could you clear the table, dear?" Which I didn't mind the first time. I mean, I'm a guest, and it's polite to help out, right? But then it's, "Can you wash those dishes?" And "Why don't you serve the dessert?" Meanwhile, my boyfriend is just sitting there, scrolling on his phone or chatting with his dad. It's like they expect me to play maid while they all relax. The dynamic feels so ingrained, and I'm constantly questioning why he doesn't see how unfair this is. The last time we visited, things hit a breaking point. We were having dinner, and Mary made another one of her lovely comments about how I should learn how to cook properly if I want to keep my boyfriend happy. I just snapped. I told her, "Actually, Mary, I don't need any lessons, but maybe you could learn some respect." Dead silence. Like, you could hear a pin drop silence. Then John chimes in, calling me rude and ungrateful. He actually said, "We've been nothing but kind to you, and this is how you treat us." Kind? I'm sorry, expecting me to be your housemaid and constantly putting me down as kind? After dinner, my boyfriend didn't say a word to them. I thought maybe he was finally upset on my behalf, but nope. The second we got in the car, he went off on me. He said I embarrassed him and overreacted, that I should have just let it go, because that's how they are. I told him I'm sick of feeling like I'm on my own when it comes to his parents. I asked him, "Why don't you ever stand up for me?" And he just shrugged and said, "It's not a big deal." Not a big deal? I've spent 2 years feeling disrespected and unsupported, and he's calling me dramatic for finally speaking up. I told him if he's not willing to back me up, maybe we need to rethink our relationship. He said I was being ridiculous and ended the conversation. Now I'm here, questioning everything. Was I wrong for snapping? Should I have handled it differently? Am I overreacting by thinking about breaking up with him? I've been replaying that evening in my head over and over. Every little detail, every glance, every sigh. I remember Mary's smirk when she told me how I should cook. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was deliberate, almost calculated to provoke a reaction. And then John, with his faux indignation, acting as if I'd committed some grave sin by standing up for myself. It's exhausting to think about, but I can't help myself. This pattern isn't new. The signs were there from the beginning. The first time I met his parents, Mary looked me up and down like she was appraising a piece of furniture. I remember she made a comment about my dress being a little casual for the occasion. Back then, I laughed it off, thinking she was just a little blunt. But as the months went on, her comments became sharper, more targeted. And John? He's always been Mary's cheerleader, backing her up no matter what she says. It's like they're a team, united in their disapproval of me. And my boyfriend? He's always been neutral. He says he doesn't want to take sides, but his silence feels like a betrayal. When I'm being criticized, he doesn't defend me. When I'm being treated unfairly, he doesn't step in. It's like he's more concerned about keeping the peace than about my feelings. I've tried talking to him about it so many times. I've explained how much it hurts me, how isolated I feel, but he always brushes it off. That's just how they are, he says. Don't take it personally. But how can I not take it personally when it's directed at me? How can I not feel hurt when the people who are supposed to be family treat me like an outsider? I've always believed that relationships are about partnership, about standing together even when things get tough. But right now, it feels like I'm standing alone. I've been confiding in my best friend about all of this. She's been a rock, listening to me vent and offering advice. She's told me I deserve better, that I shouldn't settle for someone who doesn't have my back. And deep down, I know she's right. But it's hard to let go of someone you love, even when you know they're not giving you what you need. I've invested so much in this relationship. I've shared my life, my dreams, my vulnerabilities. Walking away feels like admitting defeat. And then there's the fear. What if I'm overreacting? What if I'll never find someone who loves me the way he does? What if I'm expecting too much? These thoughts keep me up at night, swirling in my mind like a storm I can't escape. I've always prided myself on being strong, on handling challenges with grace. But this feels like too much. Every time I think about the future, I'm filled with uncertainty. Can I see myself marrying into a family that doesn't respect me? Can I imagine a lifetime of letting it go just to keep the peace? And what about kids? If we ever have children, would they be subjected to the same toxic dynamics? These are the questions that haunt me, that make me question everything I thought I knew about love and commitment. As I sit here, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I'm struck by how tired I look. Not just physically tired, but emotionally drained. This isn't who I used to be. I used to be confident, full of life, ready to take on the world. But now I feel like a shadow of myself, constantly second-guessing, constantly trying to prove my worth. And for what? For a relationship that's supposed to make me happy, but instead leaves me feeling empty? The thought of confronting him again fills me with dread. I know how it will go. He'll tell me I'm overthinking, that I'm making a big deal out of nothing. He'll promise to talk to them, but never actually do it. And I'll be left feeling even more alone, even more unseen. It's a cycle I've lived through so many times, and I'm not sure I have the strength to go through it again. So here I am, stuck in this limbo, unsure of what to do next. The only thing I know for certain is that something has to change. I can't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells, constantly questioning my own worth. I deserve better. I just need to find the courage to believe it. The next morning after that disastrous dinner, I woke up feeling emotionally hungover. My head was pounding, my chest felt heavy, and I didn't even want to get out of bed. My boyfriend was already up, sitting on the couch and scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. I stared at him for a moment, wondering how he could act so normal when everything felt so wrong. Did he not feel the tension that was still thick in the air? Did he not realize how much his silence had hurt me? When I finally joined him, he barely looked up. I sat down next to him and tried to start a conversation, but he quickly changed the subject every time I brought up his parents. "Can we not do this right now?" he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I just want a quiet morning." A quiet morning? After everything that happened? It felt like another slap in the face. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The crisp morning air was a welcome change from the suffocating atmosphere in the apartment. As I walked, I thought about how I'd gotten to this point. How had I ended up in a relationship where I felt so unsupported? I passed by a park and saw a couple laughing together, their heads close as they shared a moment of intimacy. It was a stark contrast to what I was experiencing, and it made my heart ache. I wanted that. I deserved that. By the time I got back, I had resolved to have a real conversation with my boyfriend. Not the kind where he brushes me off or minimizes my feelings, but a genuine, honest talk. I walked into the apartment and found him still on the couch, now playing a video game. I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage, and then I said, "We need to talk." He groaned, pausing his game. "About what?" he asked, as if he didn't already know. "About last night. About your parents. About us," I said, my voice steady but firm. He sighed and put the controller down, finally giving me his full attention. I told him everything I'd been feeling, how his parents' constant criticism made me feel small, how his inaction made me feel alone, and how I was starting to question whether this relationship was right for me. He listened, but his expression was hard to read. When I finished, there was a long silence. "I get that you're upset," he finally said, "but you're blowing this way out of proportion. My parents are just old-fashioned. They don't mean anything by it." "Old-fashioned?" I repeated, incredulous. "Calling me unclassy, criticizing my job, and treating me like a maid is old-fashioned? That's not old-fashioned. That's disrespectful." He shrugged. "That's just how they are. They're not going to change, so you're going to have to get used to it." "Why should I have to get used to being disrespected?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why can't you stand up for me? Why can't you tell them that the way they treat me is not okay?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "It's not that simple," he said. "They're my parents. I can't just start fights with them." "But you're okay with me fighting with them?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "You're okay with me being the bad guy while you sit back and say nothing?" He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he got defensive. "You're making me choose between you and my family," he said. "That's not fair." "I'm not asking you to choose," I said, exasperated. "I'm asking you to support me, to have my back. Isn't that what partners are supposed to do?" The conversation went in circles for what felt like hours, neither of us willing to budge. By the end of it, I was exhausted, and it was clear that nothing had been resolved. He went back to his game, and I went to the bedroom, feeling more alone than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts. Was this really the life I wanted? A partner who wouldn't stand up for me, who dismissed my feelings, who expected me to just get used to being treated poorly. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had to change. The next day, I decided to take some time for myself. I told my boyfriend I needed space and went to stay with my best friend. She welcomed me with open arms, letting me vent and cry and process everything I was feeling. Being with her was like a breath of fresh air. She reminded me of who I was before this relationship, strong, confident, and unapologetically myself. During my time away, I started to reflect on why I'd stayed in this relationship for so long. Was it love? Or was it fear? Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of admitting that I'd made a mistake. I realized that I'd been holding on to the idea of what our relationship could be, rather than accepting what it actually was. I also started to think about boundaries, something I'd never really considered before. I'd always thought that being in a relationship meant compromising, but I was beginning to see that there's a difference between compromise and sacrifice. I'd been sacrificing my self-respect, my happiness, and my sense of self for the sake of this relationship. And for what? To avoid conflict? To keep the peace? It wasn't worth it. My best friend encouraged me to write down everything I wanted in a partner, everything I needed to feel loved and supported. It was a surprisingly emotional exercise, but it helped me gain clarity. As I looked at the list, I realized that my boyfriend wasn't meeting most of those needs. And the truth was, he probably never would. By the end of the week, I felt stronger, more grounded. I knew what I had to do, even though the thought of it filled me with dread. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't keep hurting myself by staying in a relationship that wasn't right for me. When I returned to the apartment, my boyfriend seemed relieved to see me. He gave me a tentative smile, but I could tell he was nervous. "I missed you," he said, pulling me into a hug. For a moment, I let myself sink into the familiarity of his embrace. But then I pulled back, looked him in the eyes, and said, "We need to talk." As I sat there, facing him once again, I couldn't ignore the knot tightening in my chest. This wasn't how I imagined our relationship would feel 2 years in. I thought we'd be planning a future, dreaming of what could be, but instead, I was questioning everything, every word, every action, every moment where I had let things slide just to avoid rocking the boat. "We need to talk" were the hardest words to say, but they were out now, hanging in the air like a fragile thread. My boyfriend's eyes flicked away for a moment, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond immediately, as if preparing himself for what was coming next. "Okay," he said finally, his tone cautious. "What's on your mind?" What wasn't on my mind? The endless string of criticisms from his parents, his constant silence when I needed his support, the growing sense of loneliness that seemed to be creeping into every corner of my life. But where to begin? I've been thinking a lot while I was away. I started, my voice steady but soft, about us, about what I need from this relationship and whether I'm getting it. His posture stiffened slightly, but he nodded for me to continue. "I feel like I'm constantly fighting battles alone," I said. "When your parents criticize me, it's not just about what they say. It's about the fact that you don't stand up for me. It's about feeling like I'm not important enough for you to defend." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "Please, just let me finish," I said. He closed his mouth and leaned back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I know that your parents are important to you," I continued. "And I'm not asking you to choose between us, but I'm asking you to see things from my perspective. Imagine if it were the other way around, if my family treated you the way your parents treat me. How would that make you feel?" He frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know," he muttered. "I guess it wouldn't feel great." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward slightly. "It doesn't feel great. It feels awful. And what makes it worse is that the one person I should be able to count on you doesn't do anything about it. You just sit there, like it's not happening." "It's not that simple," he said, his voice defensive. "They're my parents. I can't just tell them to stop." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Why can't you set boundaries with them? Why can't you tell them that their behavior is hurtful and unacceptable?" He didn't answer right away, and the silence between us felt heavy. Finally, he said, "Because it won't change anything. They're set in their ways. They've been like this my whole life. But it could change something for me," I said quietly. "It could show me that you care about how I'm feeling, that you're willing to stand up for me, even if it's hard." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said. "I'm not good at this stuff. Confrontation, feelings. It's just not me." "I'm not asking you to be perfect," I said. "I'm asking you to try, to show me that you're willing to fight for this relationship, for us." There was another long pause, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to say the right thing, but he didn't know how. And as much as I wanted to believe that this conversation would change things, a part of me wondered if it would just be another cycle of promises and disappointment. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll talk to them." It wasn't the resounding declaration of support I'd been hoping for, but it was something. A small step forward in a journey that felt impossibly long. Over the next few weeks, I watched him carefully, looking for signs that he was making an effort. He did talk to his parents, though the conversation didn't go as well as I'd hoped. Mary and John were dismissive, as usual, and his attempts to set boundaries were met with resistance. But at least he tried, and that meant something to me. Still, the dynamic between us didn't change much. He was still hesitant to confront them directly when things got tense, and I still felt like I was walking on eggshells every time we visited. It was exhausting, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. One evening, after another strained dinner with his parents, I found myself sitting alone on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The cool night air felt refreshing against my skin, but it couldn't chase away the heaviness in my chest. I'd spent so much time hoping that things would get better, but now I was starting to wonder if I was just fooling myself. "Hey," he said softly, stepping out onto the balcony. I glanced at him, then turned my gaze back to the skyline. "Hey," I replied, my voice distant. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down next to me. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No," I said honestly. "I'm not okay." He didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to continue. "I'm tired," I said finally. "I'm tired of feeling like I don't matter. I'm tired of pretending that everything's fine when it's not. And I'm tired of waiting for things to change when they never do." "I know," he said quietly. "I know I've messed up, and I know it's not enough, but I'm trying. I really am." I looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. He looked genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Trying wasn't enough. I needed more than words. I needed action, consistency, proof that he was willing to fight for us. As the night stretched on, we sat there in silence, the distance between us growing wider with each passing moment. And for the first time, I began to wonder if love alone was enough to bridge that gap. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a fog. Everything was muted, heavy, uncertain. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into anything that could distract me from the growing void in my relationship. But no matter how much I tried to focus on other things, the questions kept creeping back into my mind. Was I asking for too much? Was I being unreasonable? Or was I simply reaching the limits of what this relationship could offer? One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There were pictures of us from the early days of our relationship, smiling, carefree, full of hope. There were selfies from trips we'd taken, moments that had felt so perfect at the time. Looking at those photos now felt bittersweet, like I was peering into a different life. I wanted to feel that way again, but the reality of our present situation felt so far removed from those happy memories. I decided to call my sister. She's always been the pragmatic one, the voice of reason in my life. When I told her everything that had been happening, she listened without interrupting, letting me pour my heart out. "It sounds like you've been carrying this relationship on your own," she said when I finished. "And that's not fair to you. Relationships are supposed to be partnerships. If he's not willing to meet you halfway, then what are you really holding on to?" Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd always prided myself on being strong, on being able to handle challenges, but maybe I'd been too focused on holding everything together to see how much it was costing me. I thanked her for her advice, and as I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of clarity, a sense that I needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, I decided to take a day off work. I needed space to think, to process everything without the noise of daily life. I spent hours walking through the city, letting my thoughts wander. I ended up at a small cafe where I ordered a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world go by. It was peaceful, but it also made me realize how long it had been since I'd felt this kind of calm. So much of my energy had been spent managing the turmoil in my relationship that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without stress. When I got home that evening, my boyfriend was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone as usual. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he said. "How was your day?" I hesitated, then said, "We need to talk." His smile faded, and he put his phone down. "What's wrong?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew. I sat down across from him, folding my hands in my lap. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began. "About us, about what I need, and whether this relationship is giving me that." His expression shifted to one of apprehension. "I thought we were doing better," he said. "I've been trying, haven't I?" "You have," I acknowledged. "And I appreciate that. But it's not just about effort. It's about whether we're really compatible, whether we're building something that can last. And right now, I don't know if we are." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I love you," he said earnestly. "I don't want to lose you. Tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I don't think it's that simple," I said softly. "It's not about doing one thing or fixing one issue. It's about the way we communicate, the way we support each other, the way we handle challenges. Those things aren't easy to change overnight, but I can change," he insisted. "I want to change. I want to be better for you. And I want to believe that. I said, my voice breaking slightly. But I can't keep putting my happiness on hold while I wait for things to get better. I need to feel valued and supported now, not someday in the future. Tears filled his eyes, and for the first time, I saw just how much this conversation was affecting him. You mean everything to me, he said. I don't want to lose you. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. I don't want to lose you either, I said. But I also can't keep losing myself in the process. We sat there in silence for a long time, holding hands but feeling miles apart. The love between us was still there, but it was tangled up in so much pain and misunderstanding. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that something had to change for both of us. In the days that followed, we tried to find our footing. We had more conversations, some filled with hope, others with frustration. I started seeing a therapist to help me process my feelings and figure out what I truly wanted. He promised to do the same, though I wasn't sure if he actually would. The uncertainty was difficult, but it also felt like a necessary part of the journey. As I moved through this period of introspection, I began to rediscover parts of myself that I'd neglected for too long. I reconnected with friends, took up a new hobby, and started focusing on my own happiness instead of constantly trying to fix things with him. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering what things might look like a year from now. Would we still be together, stronger and more connected than ever? Or would we have gone our separate ways, each finding our own path to happiness? The answers weren't clear, and maybe they didn't need to be. For now, all I could do was take things one day at a time, trusting that I'd find my way forward, no matter what. As the weeks turned into months, the fog in my mind began to lift, and clarity slowly crept in. The tension in our relationship hadn't lessened, despite multiple conversations and promises of change. I realized that the small moments of progress, a kind gesture here, an apology there, weren't enough to outweigh the deeper issues that continued to persist. I loved him, but love wasn't solving the problem. And maybe that was the hardest lesson to learn, that love alone wasn't always enough. I spent more time focusing on myself, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering the hobbies I'd pushed aside. I joined a local painting class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. Each brushstroke felt therapeutic, as if I was painting away the heaviness that had taken up residence in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was coming back to myself. Meanwhile, my boyfriend seemed to be retreating further into himself. He would make half-hearted attempts to talk about our issues, but it was clear that he was more comfortable pretending everything was fine. It was frustrating, but also enlightening. It showed me how differently we approached conflict and growth. While I was willing to do the hard work, he seemed content to avoid it, hoping the problems would resolve themselves over time. One evening, as I was packing up my supplies after a painting session, I got a text from him. "Dinner tonight?" My treat. I hesitated before replying, then agreed. Part of me wanted to believe that this could be a turning point, that maybe he had something important to say. But another part of me knew that this was likely just another attempt to gloss over the cracks in our foundation. We met at a small Italian restaurant we'd frequented in the early days of our relationship. The familiarity of the place stirred up memories of laughter, of shared dreams and whispered secrets. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't just another date night. As we sat across from each other, he started with small talk, asking about my day and how my painting was going. I answered politely, but kept my responses short. Finally, after a long pause, I said, "We need to talk about us." He sighed, setting down his fork. "I figured that's why you agreed to come tonight," he said. "So, let's talk." I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, "about what I want, what I need, and whether this relationship is giving me those things. And honestly, I don't think it is." His brow furrowed. "I thought we were making progress," he said. "I've been trying, haven't I?" "You have," I acknowledged. "But it's not just about trying. It's about whether we're truly compatible, whether we're building a life together that feels good for both of us. And I don't think we are." "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic. "Are you breaking up with me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "I think it's what we need," I said. "This relationship has taught me so much about myself, about what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not. And as much as I care about you, I can't keep sacrificing my own happiness and sense of self." He looked down at the table, his shoulders slumping. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly, "but I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe it's not about fixing it," I said gently. "Maybe it's about letting go and giving ourselves the chance to find the happiness we both deserve." The rest of the evening was quiet. We finished our meals in near silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When the check came, he insisted on paying despite my protests. "One last time," he said with a sad smile. As we walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air wrapped around us. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, he pulled me into a hug. "I'll always care about you," he said. "And I'll always care about you," I replied, my voice breaking. We went our separate ways that night, and while it was painful, it also felt like the right decision. Over the weeks that followed, I focused on healing, on rebuilding my life without the weight of a relationship that wasn't serving me. There were moments of doubt, moments where I missed him and questioned whether I'd made the right choice. But those moments became fewer and farther between as I leaned into the life I was creating for myself. I continued painting, eventually signing up for a local art show where I displayed my work for the first time. The experience was nerve-wracking but exhilarating, and it reminded me of the joy that comes from pursuing my passions. I also started journaling regularly, using it as a way to process my emotions and reflect on my journey. One day, months after our breakup, I ran into him at a coffee shop. He looked well happier even. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up briefly before going our separate ways. As I walked away, I felt a sense of peace. There was no bitterness, no regret, just gratitude for what we'd shared and for the lessons it had taught me. Looking back, I realized that ending the relationship wasn't a failure. It was an act of love for myself and for him. It was a recognition that we both deserved more than what we could give each other. And as I moved forward, I carried that lesson with me, knowing that the right relationship would never require me to compromise who I am. Life went on, as it always does. I continued to grow, to explore, to embrace the person I was becoming. And while the chapter with him had come to an end, it was just one part of my story, a story that was still unfolding, full of possibility and hope.